All right, and we are live. Welcome everyone to this MAA Virtual Distinguished Lecture. I'm Deirdre Longacre Smeltzer, Senior Director for Programs with the MAA, and I'm here with my colleague, Kiara. We will get started in just a minute with the presentation, but first I want to welcome everyone who's joining us. One of the things that we love about doing virtual events is that people can join us from all around the globe. So the YouTube chat should be active throughout this event. So if you'd like to, just drop in the chat where you're tuning in from. It's fun to see where people are joining from. We've got a great presenter lined up for tonight's lecture. Dr. Michael Lopez will be speaking to us about using data within the context of the National Football League. So this should be interesting for sports fans as well as math enthusiasts. So if you're a football fan joining us, you can also feel free to drop in the chat who your favorite team is or some other football fact that you'd like us to know about yourself. We're looking forward to this math sports combo event tonight.
I love that. I love that. I'm Kiara Edwards. I'm the Director of Programs and Grants Management at MAA. Really excited for tonight's lecture. Great to be serving as a co-host with my lovely colleague Deirdre. It's crazy, Deirdre, how we're doing all of these great virtual programs around math and sports. I think it was in February for our virtual program series. We did a Get in the Game virtual program run by Dr. Tim Chartier and Dr. Felicia Stukes, where they did a great program around using data for sports analytics. And tonight we're going to learn about using data to optimize the rules of the NFL. So love that we're doing a sports theme. So for all the sports enthusiasts, you're in the right place tonight.
That's right.
Yeah, for our virtual programs though, and I also say that we are accepting proposals for virtual programs. So if you have maybe a sports theme or any kind of a proposal that you would be interested in submitting for an MAA virtual program session, please be sure to go ahead and submit a proposal. They're due by July 1st. So if you have a great idea, we would love to hear about it. I'll put a link in the chat.
All right, thanks, Kiara. And just to make one other connection to MAA programs, if you teach math or statistics, I'm sure you are aware of the value and effectiveness of utilizing real data in your courses. I think we'll get a taste of that tonight. But one of our long-running NSF, National Science Foundation funded programs, StatPrep, has a focus on resourcing instructors to use a data-centric approach in teaching introductory statistics concepts. So if you are interested in learning more about this approach, I encourage you to sign up there's a StatPrep mini course at MAA Math Fest in early August. So there's another great opportunity to learn more about using data within your classes. Well, it is a few minutes past the top of the hour, so let's go ahead and get started with the program. Welcome again to all of you who are joining us for tonight's virtual distinguished lecture. My name is Deirdre Longacre Smeltzer, and I am Senior Director for Programs at the Mathematical Association of America. I'm delighted that you're here for tonight's event. As we begin, I want to reiterate that the chat feature is available throughout this event. So feel free to use that as a venue to ask questions or respond to our speaker's presentation. And then we will take time at the end of the presentation for Q&A with our speaker. So with that, I will invite the MAA Executive Director, Dr. Michael Pearson, to introduce tonight's speaker.
Thank you, Deirdre. And thank you, Kiara, as well. And Michael, great to have you here tonight. We're really excited to have you here. I am looking forward to learning a lot more about your work. I grew up in the Deep South, so I'm a longtime Saints fan, which I'm not sure if that means I like football or I'm just a little masochistic. But in any case, I'm particularly interested in hearing tonight about how your work with the competitions committee, the interplay of that and rules changes. I think that's absolutely fascinating. I'm sure a lot of folks with us tonight are going to enjoy that. So I think we're all looking forward to that. In any case, Dr. Lopez is a senior director for football data and analytics at the National Football League. He's been with the NFL for 4 years. He got his undergraduate degree at Bates College, a master's in statistics at University of Massachusetts, and his PhD in biostats at Brown. And he's been teaching until fairly recently at Skidmore College, but recently moved to Connecticut. So has all you folks in Connecticut, if you're looking for somebody to teach a class here and there, he might be interested. I understand he still likes to work with students. So Michael, without taking too much of your time, I'm going to turn it over to you and enjoy the talk myself as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Pearson, Deirdre, and Kara. Thank you as well. And to all folks at the MAA, really appreciate the opportunity. To your point, the Saints are a great team. There are 31 other really excellent NFL teams. We support all of them equally. But yeah, it's fun to be a part of sports and statistics and watching the field grow. So I'll talk a little bit about how our team works at the NFL with respect to the rules of the game, and specifically, let me just make sure I show my slides. How we view statistical tools to better understand, what's going on in the game of football. So this is, I think, my second MAA talk. My first one actually came several years ago. And about that time I'll talk about a couple of things, but this is my first abstract. I was a student at Bates College. I was a math major. I was a football player at Bates. And so majored in math because I kind of like the field. I got the coveted 5:15 p.m. slot at Framingham State at the Northeast section of the MAA. I think it was a Friday afternoon, and I was talking about the Babylonian derivation of the square root of 2. It was interesting and certainly, was something I was excited about in presenting my research. The field is now a little bit different in the sense that, that was one area for folks that were interested in data and statistics and mathematical tools. But it's grown up a little bit. And in fact, most things have changed other than the logo. I see the MAA logo is pretty similar year over year. But it really is an honor to be here and have this opportunity to give another talk with the MAA. At that point, 20 years ago, this was the league's logo or something similar for what the league provided for statistics, game stats and information systems. This is roughly when the modern NFL data era started. In fact, we have access to our internal play-by-play. I don't really trust it anywhere prior to 2002. So again, about 20 years we've had, this information. It's stored in a SQL server and we can access it. That's what our teams get access to. And when I say, modern NFL data, I'm talking about, your traditional fantasy stats, right? You would have yards thrown, average yards per catch, who catches the ball, who throws it, what happened on the play. You would get who would make the tackle. We now track whether the quarterback was hit, things like that. But again, it's a level of NFL data, but it isn't really all that fancy. Fast forward to where we are now. This is an animation using our next gen stats. Each of the players that is on the field at a given time in the NFL wears 2 RFID chips, one in each of their shoulders. That tracks where the players go, wherever they go on the field. It records 10 frames per second. It's stored. Teams access it. The league itself accesses it. And as I'll talk about in a little bit, the league also shares it. And so we get some of that data, but we also like to share it publicly. And it really speaks to sort of how the game has changed, because you're going from, roughly 160 rows per game if you average about 160 plays. The traditional next-gen stats will have, each play is at least that, and each game will probably be about 300,000 or 400,000 rows of data. About 20 years ago as well was maybe when some of the prominent NFL research that involves data also really started to take form. One of the most famous papers from David Romer talks about team behavior on fourth downs. It makes the argument that teams should be more aggressive in fourth downs. At that point, I think it was 2006, the coach of the Steelers, at that point, Bill Cowher, had a quote that I reference and I think about maybe all too often. If we all listen to the professor, we may all be looking for professor jobs. Again, let's look at where we are now. This is a snippet of the current team analytics staffers. I'm stealing this from Seth Walder, a writer on ESPN. This is not all teams, but as you can see, there are teams that have half dozen, maybe more analysts that are devoted to analyzing data. And at least one of the folks on this list, Andrew Healy with the Browns, used to be a former professor. I was also a former professor. So I think it's kind of come full circle, in which case the league is now actually looking for professors. Again, 20 years ago, here's a picture of Mike Lopez. I was a football player. My dad was a football coach. My dad played football in college. So football was really sort of part of my blood. But it was interesting when I went to go write a thesis, there wasn't football data. That's a picture of my thesis. It's on Nomar Garcia-Pera and Derek Jeter and trying to figure out who was the better shortstop. I don't really care about shortstops nearly as much as I care about centers and left guards. But the reality is there wasn't data out there for football analysts to look at. So again, that's something that's a little bit different now. We do have a league-sponsored event. If you're interested in football data, if your students are interested in football data, there's a link up there, and that's a picture of our first year in the winning group from Simon Fraser. But there is football data out there. It's a much different world at this point. In a related note, that's probably the only reason I got the job that I have now, is that there is a lot more data for the league to analyze. So let's talk a little bit about some of the work that we've done at the league office to better analyze data and try to think about how we can apply it to football. So I'll start with a general question, and this can transcend really any sport or competitive environment, which is, what do you do at the end of a regulation period when the score is tied? So I'll walk you through a little bit about the timeline of NFL overtimes. It was first introduced in 1940 in postseason. Then it expanded to a different round of the postseason in 1946. But for a long time, there were a lot more tied games. Sudden death overtime was introduced in 1974. It was a 15-minute period. Football in 1974 was much different than football now. It wouldn't be uncommon to have 15 minutes that nobody would score. So the way that you would design an overtime for 1974 is much different than how you would design an overtime for 2022. Field goal kickers got too good, and that's one of the changes that happened, is that teams got really good at kicking field goals. So you could get a couple first downs, you could go down and kick a field goal, and by sudden death, that field goal ends the game. So in 2010, they changed the rules so that each team was guaranteed at least one possession unless the team that possessed the ball first scored a touchdown. It was tested in 2010 and then fully implemented in 2012. That stuck through 2017 when the minute period got shortened from 15 to 10. So that's where the NFL was. There'll be some small tweaks to that coming out of this year's offseason. But that gives you a sort of example of how overtime has evolved over time. Across professional sport, it might be interesting to think about how the NFL compares to other leagues. For us, this was interesting because it is important to understand, do we have a lot of overtime already, or do we not have a lot of overtime relative to other leagues? If you look at based on either the percent of games going to overtime, which is the first row, about 5.5% of NFL games go to overtime, or the percent of games spent in overtime, which is the second row, the NFL under indexes. In other words, the NFL spends fewer percentage of its game going to overtime, and when it does go to overtime, a fewer percent of overall game time is spent there. Contrast that to, for example, the NHL, which, about a decade and a half ago implemented rules which actually purposely led to more overtime games. So the NFL, we're currently a little under indexing on how often we're in overtime, and maybe that helps contextualize where we should be going. Another argument that comes up a lot is, how does the NFL compare to other leagues of football? The most common one to compare to is the college rule. So the NFL is, again, 10 minutes in the regular season. The game ends with a first drive touchdown. Otherwise, we go to that sudden death. In NCAA, for most levels of college, teams get alternating possessions. So if I'm the first team, if I'm Bates College and I'm going against Colby, I go first, I score a touchdown. Colby still gets to try and go down and try and score. The questions we thought a lot about this year as we pertain to the rules of overtime is, let's actually think a step back before we settle the argument of whether NFL is better than NCAA. We want to think about what do we want out of an overtime. When we figure out what we want out of an overtime, mathematically, we can start to set up some equations. From a statistics perspective, what is the yes demand that we're actually after? I spent a long time in grad school, and probably the best take-home message that I got, at either UMass or Brown, was, what is the yes demand of interest? And my background was in causal inference then, and the yes demand is something that causal inference folks take a lot of time to derive and write out. Right? If you're interested in running a linear regression or multiple regression, right? How do you interpret your coefficient of interest there? From our perspective, what are we trying to solve for? What is the actual number that we're trying to get? And then what is the best way to get that number? That's probably how we spend most of our time. The actual process of doing it doesn't take nearly as long as is the process of thinking about it. What are we trying to achieve at the NFL for overtime? So this involved not, the opinion of Mike Lopez. This is the opinion of the competition committee and the folks that we work with on the rules of the game. A couple quotes to lead off with. Our job is to ensure that NFL football is the greatest competitive sport in the world. That is the mission statement of football operations. And then from 1940 in the rules committee, each game should provide a maximum of entertainment insofar as it can be controlled by the rules and the officials. So we know from our history we're after competitiveness and entertainment, but we're also in an overtime session, we're after fairness. We're also after expeditious. And one of the realities of expeditious isn't just about having something that ends quickly. It's about having something that ends quickly so more players don't get hurt. Next is it exciting, right? We want that entertainment. And the last one, which we do think about, although maybe it's not in bold because it's a little bit of a lesser weight, is it simple to explain? Ideally, we have something that's easy to explain. And so here's sort of a table if I want to compare NFL to NCAA, and this is just sort of, for sake of how we would think about it. The NFL is traditional football, right? You can have punts, you can have kickoffs, you can have field goals and extra points in overtime. NCAA, not so much. And that, for most folks in the NFL, is the biggest limitation of the NCAA system. The NFL system has been fair. I would draw the arrow to the point that maybe it's less fair now given changes to the game. NCAA also has some limitations in fairness. There's what's known as the second mover advantage in NCAA, where the team that goes second has some additional information that the team that goes first does not have. Is it expeditious? NFL overtime averages about 18 plays. Maybe that's high, maybe that's low. We would generally call it neutral. Is it exciting? I think both are pretty exciting formats. Fans seem to really like the NCAA one. And so to answer the question of what overtime is best, and that's not our job, but just a way of thinking about how we solve for these things. If you really like traditional football, you'll probably like the NFL's more than the NCAA's. If you really like the excitement and maybe want something that ends a little bit quicker, maybe you would like the NCAA's. So let's fast forward to this offseason with where we ended up as the league. Again, our current format is the league in the regular season games and postseason prior to this year. The game will end with an opening drive touchdown. Two teams this year, the Colts and the Eagles, had a different format that they proposed. Under their proposal, each team was guaranteed one possession, and if the game was still tied, it went to sudden death. So again, the real difference is what happens on that first drive. In the current rule, if a team scores a touchdown, that's it, the game ends. Under this proposal, which is the one we're trying to analyze, each team would be guaranteed one possession. Some current overtime stats just to get you familiar with some of the things that we're traditionally looking at. This table shows the record for teams that won the coin toss under the different systems that the NFL has had recently. I mentioned that I kind of started 15, 20 years ago with modern NFL data. We're doing the same thing here, given changes to the game. A couple numbers to point out. Teams that won the coin toss always receive the ball by and large. They are 10-2 in the postseason. So again, only 12 games, but perhaps that number stands out as, when our best teams are on the field in the biggest moments, 83% of the time, the team that wins the coin toss is the eventual winner of the game. If we look across the last 5 seasons, 2017 to 21, the win percentage for teams that win the coin toss is about 56%. And for reference, is that high, is that low? I think most folks would want the impact of the coin toss to be maybe a little bit closer to 50%. League average is about 15 plays per season, and I mentioned that we average about 18 plays per overtime. We can track by season, and the line here is showing the trend line under the current rule, which would be the modified sudden death. So that started again in 2012. There does seem to be a subtle uptick, not a significant one. I would say that given what we know about the game has changed, teams go for it more on fourth down. We have better offenses than we did in 2012. We also changed the touchback line so that the drive actually starts 5 yards closer to the end zone. So it does suggest that it seems reasonable that teams that receive the ball that win the coin toss, they are probably in better shape. So again, sort of summarizing what we know, we average about 15 overtime games a season. That's what we're trying to better understand. And we do have some benefit here to winning the coin toss. So why does that matter? I go back to what we're trying to solve for. We're trying to get traditional football. We want it to be fair. We want it to be expeditious, and we want it to get exciting. The one thing that stood out, and it stood out to the Colts, and it stood out to the Eagles, which is why they proposed it, is our system is currently not as fair as it could be, right? And over time, what has happened is we had something that was relatively fair, that was closer to 50-50. And now I'm putting a red flag next to it because there is a benefit to receiving the ball. And that is something we feel pretty confident in. All right, so let's go one by one. Let's figure out how we can improve the equity of our overtime format. So again, what are we trying to achieve here? We want better balance. We want the team that wins the coin toss to not have as big of a benefit here. And so what are we after? Our estimate is we want to know what is the change in each team's chance of winning the game that is due to the coin toss, right? They flip a coin at midfield. All but 3 times in the last 150 overtimes has the team chose to receive, right? What is the shift? What is the benefit that team gets because of the result of the coin toss? That's what we're after. So here's our best estimate of where we are now. And I say where we are now as if basically putting ourselves in the position where we were in March. All the blue squares correspond to 1%. And so if you look, the team that receives the ball or the team that wins the coin toss, there's 54 of them. That represents the fact that they win about 54% of the time. 39% of the time they'll lose. 7% of the time they'll tie. And so the difference between winning and losing the coin toss, our best bet, is the difference between the blue squares and the red squares. We estimate that to be about 15 percentage points. In other words, the team that wins, that's a bump of plus 15 that is given due to the coin toss. That plus 15 is an estimate. It does not speak to all games. Your outcome of the coin toss and the importance is different if you have two offenses that struggle to score versus if you were the Chiefs and Bills in the postseason, where it was pretty likely that, or more likely than not, that the team that received the ball was going to go down and score a touchdown initially. There are also health issues in terms of, maybe your quarterback got hurt, game conditions. It's harder to score a touchdown when it's really windy, especially if that wind is pointing in one direction. There's a lot of other things going on, but again, our best estimate comes down to about plus 15%. If you're curious where that number comes from, well, it's pretty similar to the empirical data we showed you earlier, right? What have we observed in recent seasons? You can also look at live numbers from betting markets and looking at how the betting markets react to the coin toss. They'll also peg it somewhere around 15%. We've used simulation models, which I'll talk a little bit about in a bit, basically trying to simulate overtime from the start of it. We would get a number pretty similar to plus 15% as well. All right, we can actually break that 54% down. We have 2 mutually exclusive outcomes here that happen. You can either win the drive on your first possession, or you can win after the first possession. So if we look at how often the team that receives the ball goes down and scores a touchdown, that's that number at the bottom. They win about 20% of the time on that first possession. The other 34% of that comes from when they win after the first possession. And why is this important? Because the rule change that was suggested would only impact that row on the bottom. It's only going to impact the light blue squares. So started separating out, like, where are we going to see an impact of this rule change? Well, we're going to see it on the left side there, right? We're going to see it on those drives that initially ended on the first drive. But now if we're guaranteeing another possession, they're not going to end again. Puts us in an interesting spot, though, which is we know about 20% of our overtimes would be impacted. But we now have a setting that doesn't actually exist in the NFL. We have a second drive where the team will never, ever punt and never kick a field goal. Because, again, they're down a touchdown. They gave up a touchdown. They have the ball back. Now, there are circumstances that are probably similar, but almost all of them, the team would be fighting the game clock, in which case maybe there's a minute left or 2 minutes left. We're expecting the team would have about 5 or 6 minutes left now. How often would they score a touchdown is really the number that we're after. And we're interested in how often is that going to change in our new format. So again, we're after now, like, how would we expect our equity to change here, which goes back to figuring out how often is this team that needs a touchdown and only a touchdown and would never punt or kick a field goal, even if it's 4th and 100, right? What would they do? Well, again, we have some ideas. What we ended up settling on is a simulation framework, which is we basically devised pseudo populations of teams. We pretended that they were playing these drives that didn't exist. They start the ball at the 25, which is the typical field position. And we look at our sample of plays and say, all right, a team's going to start from the 25. Let's pick a random play here. All right, well, they picked up 3 yards. Let's pick another random play that's going to follow based on that same down, distance, yard line, and the strength of the team. Whenever that team has a 4th down, though, they're always going to go for it. They're never going to actually kick a field goal. They're never going to punt. And what we're interested in is how often do they actually go down and score. Kind of fun to see what this would look like. This is a version of an image and a version of the simulation that I wrote about on a personal blog that is linked below. You can actually go ahead and into the NFL Faster package and copy this code and run it yourself. In my fake drive here, you can sort of see it visualized on the left. A. Dalton, which at this point was Andy Dalton, throws an incomplete pass. Well, Andy Dalton at that point was on the Bengals, I think. Well, the next play is G. Coffey. He runs up the middle for 8 yards. Then Eli Manning comes on the field and completes a short pass, or is incomplete. Then the Patriots go for it on 4th down, and they get it, right? So we're like randomly picking random players and random teams and seeing how they drive down the field. In this case, the drive kind of ends pretty quickly with a Tony Romo pass to Des Bryant. I think at this point we were sampling from the last, roughly decade, which is why Tony Romo and Des Bryant would still be playing. This is one sample drive. We're going to repeat this a bunch of time and figure out how often does that team go down and score. Turns out they score about 40% of the time. It's actually a little less. There are a lot of complications. There's penalties. There's maybe a team on a 3rd and 20 that only goes for 10 yards because they know they're going to go for it again. Maybe in a game with our resampling, we're not actually picking up on it. Our best guess is somewhere between 35 and 40%. So why is that important? I can go back to the 20% that we're actually talking about and saying, okay, well, 20% of the time, we're going to get that extra drive. 60% of the time, they're not going to score, and here's my 40%. 40% of the time, they are going to go down and score. And again, what we're trying to derive back here is how often are we going to take these times that the blue team wins, and we're going to shift them to red. Well, when that team doesn't go down and score a touchdown, that area on the right, well, what's going to happen is the game's over. So the team that's going to win is still going to be the blue team. But if the team that gets the ball next goes down and scores, right, well, then we're going to have sometimes they're actually going to win the game. And so some of these times, right, we're talking about 40% of the 20%. That's now we're down to 8 boxes. But the blue team could still win, so now we're going to call it a 50-50 split. So what does this actually mean for equity? We started with about 15%. We're going to take 4% that was a first drive touchdown, and we're actually going to shift it to the red team. So our best estimate in terms of what this rule would do to regular season football, our best estimate is it takes the swing of the coin toss from about 15% down to about plus 7%. It's probably close enough if we think about team strengths, what happens on Sundays, probably close enough to 50-50 that you could certainly see a team that initially would have always wanted to receive the ball. You could certainly end up saying, hey, you know what? We want to go second in this scenario, right? And maybe they would actually be the team to start kicking off. Trying to aggregate this between regular and postseason, our current swing is about 15%. If we look across what it would be under the proposed format, we're estimating it to be about plus 7%. That plus 15, I said that was sort of an average across all games. If we look at the Kansas City-Buffalo game from this past postseason, this was 2 of our best offenses on the field. It was a back-and-forth game. It had a lot of lead changes in the fourth quarter. Our best estimate for the coin toss impact of that game was about plus 25%. So again, that's going to be a bigger swing. It's not a one-size-fits-all thing. And our best estimate is that that's a pretty massive impact. Trying to extrapolate to that exact set of teams would probably be pretty difficult. If you were to give me one guess and one guess alone, it's still going to be better to receive the ball, but it's going to take that 25%. It's going to cut it substantially, probably by more than half. So again, summarizing what we're trying to do here, well, we're trying to improve equity of our overtime format. We have a current coin toss swing that's about plus or minus 15 percentage points. That can vary by game and by team. And the rule change that is proposed by the Colts and the Eagles would cut that by more than half, likely to the point where it would be reasonable for teams to start kicking off. Next thing we want to solve for is how quickly does the overtime end? So in this case, now we're involving things like, our players getting injured, our fans still tuning in, which I'll get to a little bit as well. But again, what are we trying to achieve? We're trying to achieve something that ends quickly through the lens of health and safety primarily. What we're ultimately after, I'll start with some pretty basic high-level things. How many plays are we going to add? The corollary of the next step that teams would want to know. How many players are we expecting to get hurt in those extra plays? If we're adding a lot of plays, we're having the game drag on and on. Perhaps that would impact conditioning the following week. That was something we looked at as well. We'll start with just expected number of plays and expected number of injuries. How do we get the expected number of plays we're added? Well, we just designed a simulation model to figure it out, right? We have these simulations we can check. Those drives added about 10 plays per overtime when they happened. And based on the total number that we would expect in terms of what that does per overtime, we would expect to go from about 18 plays per overtime to about 20 plays per overtime. In the grand scheme of things, thinking back to where the NFL nets out on overtime, not an overwhelming impact, going from 18 to 20. But there are games that would have multiple possessions, which is something that the league talked about often. In terms of what this would do to injuries, the main chart here, and this comes from some of our friends that the league works with on the health and safety side on injuries from a company called IQVIA. The numbers on the left show the average injury rate per 100 plays in overtime. And you can see that in overtime, the rate is actually lower. Our best guess is the number of injuries that we would add per season across the entire league is about half an injury per season. That's across all teams and all games, so not a huge number relative to the number of plays and injuries in an NFL season. Next concern folks might have had was, what happens in overtime? Does the game drag on and on? And this was a really interesting area for us. It was something that we hadn't done a lot with, but I think it turned out to be a pretty convincing argument. The thing we'll look at here is television ratings. What happens to our TV ratings in overtime? And more hypothetically, what happens as overtime continues? We actually had an interesting design this past offseason where the same team played consecutive overtime games, where one of those overtime games went to an extra possession and the other one ended on the first possession. So from a sort of statistician's perspective and somebody that tries to often compare like things and see like maybe if they differ by one thing, what is the difference on maybe an outcome of interest? This is exactly what we were trying to look for here. So here specifically are the two teams I'm talking about, or the two games I'm talking about. Kansas City was that team. They played 2 overtime games back-to-back in the postseason. The blue line represents the minute-by-minute television ratings for the Chiefs in their divisional round game against Buffalo. That's the blue line. That has a peak of about 53 million viewers. The orange line is still the Chiefs, and in fact, still a game played in Kansas City. That orange line corresponds to the AFC Championship game between the Chiefs and the Bengals. That game peaks around 63 million. But again, the nice part here is that it's the same team at home, both in the playoffs. And the reason the orange line is a little bit higher is it's an AFC title game, so it's the next round after. But if we zoom in on what happens in overtime, we'll notice that there's a little bit of a difference in what happens in overtime. But if you look during the course of regulation, they're pretty similar. And if you notice, there are sort of like those little dips. You can probably imagine those are maybe possibly TV breaks or other breaks in the game. And then you also notice all the sort of intersection at the middle, which would be halftime. The x-axis here, and sorry I didn't clarify this, the x-axis here would be the amount of time since the game kicked off. So let's actually zoom in on what happened in overtime here. Again, the orange line is Chiefs Bengals. The buffalo line is, the blue line is Chiefs Bills. That ... there, that arrow begins when the Chiefs scored their touchdown against the Bills. And you'll notice that from the time the Chiefs scored the opening drive touchdown against the Bills, which is about 7 minutes into overtime, ratings start to plummet. And by the time you reach maybe the 15-minute mark, television ratings are about cut in half, right? So the game ends and about half your viewers are gone within, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 minutes. That 7 or 8 minute cutoff or that jump didn't happen in Bengals Chiefs, right? And in fact, it was a very slow uptick in minute by minute viewers in the Chiefs Bengals game that we did get to observe. And so you can imagine that if there was a different overtime format under the blue game when the Chiefs were playing the Bills, and the Bills were allowed that extra possession, that arrow is basically what we would have observed in viewership. Again, just sort of extrapolating where we are, we're at about 50 million viewers. And had that game had a second possession, that's about 5 minutes, possibly more, that we would have gotten to observe under the alternative format. So from a ratings perspective and understanding what happens in overtime, it certainly does seem that viewers are turning in and they look at it as among the most exciting part of the game. Another aspect that's kind of fun that is kind of a really niche football thing, but I'll quickly go through, is we could get some really exciting endings to a new format. This was maybe a little bit less data-driven and maybe a little bit more hypothetical argument, but it does involve a lot of analytics that I'll get into shortly, which is what happens if both teams score. In other words, if the first team goes down and scores a touchdown, what happens if the team that initially would have never gotten the ball now gets the ball and goes down and they also score? They're going to be faced with an interesting decision, which is they could go for an extra point to possibly tie the game, or they could go for a 2-point conversion and win the game. And it's a really good sort of, there's some elements of like win probability and how do you derive a model of game-winning chance in the NFL. There's some game theory here. Well, if you know the other team's going to go for 2, are you going to go for 2? That type of thing. Ultimately, one of the things that we did is we derived some win probability estimates for what teams would do in this situation if they had this situation. If they went for 2, what would their win probability numbers look like? If they were to kick an extra point, what would their numbers look like? The other thing that we did, and if you look at these numbers, you're much more likely to win if you go for 2 here. The other thing we did is we actually reached out to team analytics staffers. I showed you a list earlier from Seth at ESPN that has a list of all the analytical staffers that work for teams. We reached out to 6 of those folks that communicate with the head coaches on game days. And so for folks or for students that are online, this could be your future, right? This is a role. Head coaches are listening to analytics staffers, giving them advice on what to do. Anyways, we reached out to them and they all said they would go for 2 in this situation. And so we kind of have, from like an excitement standpoint, we have the TV ratings argument, but we also have this idea that we have this game deciding 2-point conversion where each team starts the play with a 50-50 shot at winning the game. The entire outcome of the game swings up at one play. And the other reality is here is, unlike maybe a game where the kicker comes on the field and it mostly comes down to what that kicker does, we have our best athletes on the play where 22 players can make a difference. We don't have that often where a game comes down to one single play. And it's something that is possible with this proposed format. Anyways, tying this all together in some of the arguments that we talked about, we were started by trying to figure out, well, overtime has a lot of different things you can argue about. We come back to 4 things that we're trying to solve for. And when we do that, it becomes much quicker and much cleaner, I should say. Certainly wasn't quick. Much cleaner to make a data-driven argument, which is we are trying to solve to maximize these 4 aspects of the game. The proposal I talked about isn't exactly going to change this from traditional football, so that's not one I talked about a lot. But in terms of fairness, we can be pretty confident that based on the change in the value of winning a coin toss, equity will be improved. That is, the impact of that coin toss on each team's chance of winning the game is going to be smaller in this proposed format. So from like what are we trying to improve? We would be improving our equity. And this was the point that we were making with the competition committee this year. Is it expeditious? We are adding plays. When I say 25 to 30 plays, that's our best estimate of the total additional number of plays that would be added in an NFL regular season. I'll give the caveat that a typical NFL season has 41,000 plays. So 25 to 30 is more or less a rounding error for us. However, these are plays at the end of a game when players are tired. And so it is relevant to sort of point out that, adding plays is probably not a great thing from a health and safety perspective. Last but not least is it exciting? We are pretty confident that between our TV ratings and the additional idea of a game deciding play, that there's a lot of elements of this proposed overtime format that would be adding to our excitement. So this is where the league nets out, right? Ultimately, we don't get to vote on what happens with these rules, but we are giving them, this information and trying to sort of clarify, how we've looked at it and maybe how it could help them make a decision. Here are the results this past offseason. The way that rules changes work is that each of the 32 clubs gets a vote, and we provided this information to head coaches, to GMs, and then eventually to owners. Taking in our information, they decided to change the rules, but only in the postseason. And so going forward, next year, the league will have a new overtime format if the playoffs go to overtime, which is that we would have this new format where each team is guaranteed a possession. I have a headline from the New York Times, and the other headline I have on the right is from Pro Football Talk. Rich McKay, who is president of the Falcons and also the chair of the competition committee, he is someone that we work with frequently in the offseason, and he is one of the folks that is gives us a good ear and provides us a lot of advice on what to look at. Interesting that he noted that overtime change was data driven, and he noted that the Chiefs-Bills game was a big factor. One of Rich's quotes, and this is, I didn't attribute to him here, but this is from Rich. I think he said it to Albert Breer, reported with Sports Illustrated. In the good old days, and I say old days, 10 years ago, we would have had less stats. And when he says stats, I think he's referring to like the game stats, the typical fantasy stats. We would have had no analytics, and we probably would have watched tape or something. Today's environment, you get so much more information. It gives you a better understanding of what the issue truly is. And that's what we got from the league office, which I think they did an excellent job of. So it was nice to know that there was some support from the folks we were talking with and that they valued the way we were looking at the data. But sort of tying it back to where I started in this talk is, he's calling it the old days of 10 years ago. But that is the reality of modern NFL data, is that it's in a much different spot than it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. The discussions are different, right? There's additional metrics, there's additional data. There's additional questions to ask, and it's why there are more and more analysts that are working for teams, that are working for vendors of the NFL, like companies like PFF, True Media, Telemetry. The list could go on. Catapult does a lot of practice data. There are a lot of folks that are interested in working with NFL data, and it's a good time to be involved in the field. How could you or your students get involved? I mentioned the Big Data Bowl, and I'll close by mentioning and talking about that. This is a league-run data science competition. The website for the competition is there. We run it ideally in person at the Combine. Our job of the Big Data Bowl goes back to some of the things that I was complaining about when I was in undergrad at Bates 20 years ago, where I didn't find any football data and had to manually pull baseball data. And I used the last name of the alphabet A and B because I like Barry Bonds and it was the quickest to get data. Anyways, that's how you had to get data 25 years ago. We're not there. You can go on Kaggle right now and download the last 3 years of Big Data Bowl data sets. It's the player tracking data. It's the same exact data that our teams are analyzing now to try and figure out how to win games. If you're a little bit unfamiliar with some of the statistical tools, or you're a little bit nervous about entering football data, we have a mentorship program where we pair analysts, junior analysts with team analytics staffers to try and get them to work on a Big Data Bowl submission, give them new ideas in football, and figure out new ways to innovate in the game. So, like I said earlier, it was a really great opportunity to be able to give this talk. The game has changed in football, from the last 15, 20 years. It's a fun time to be a part of it. There's lots of new and interesting work to do. I've mentioned overtime, but our group of the league office is doing things in the regulation time as well. I'll close. My contact information is here. You can find me on social media at my Twitter handle there. My email address is also my first name, last name at NFL.com if folks are interested in learning more about the Big Data Bowl or anything else that our group does. So I'll pause there, and thanks again to folks at the MAA for this opportunity.
That was great. Thank you so much, Michael. Really interesting presentation. We'll take a little time for if there's any audience questions or comments. We'll get to that in just a minute. But just first of all, for those of you in the audience, and it was fun to see where all you are tuning in from. But if you, first of all, if you enjoyed the presentation, you'll be able to rewatch this video as well as any of our other virtual distinguished lectures through our YouTube page moving forward. I also want to invite the attendees to share your feedback. We have just a short survey that we will link in the chat. It'll just take a few minutes of your time, and we are eager to hear your feedback about this event. And one more plug before we get to any questions that you may have. We have one more distinguished lecture coming up later this month. So a second one for this summer. Dr. Sarah Deval, who is a senior scientist at Los Alamos National Laboratory, will be talking about how can we use mathematics to model human behavior. So she'll be looking at using models, epidemiological models to model human behavior dynamics and the impact on disease spread. So obviously very relevant to current experiences. So mark your calendars for June 29 and plan to join us again at that. So I see that we have a question coming in from James Swenson asking if the competition committee believes that adding plays is bad because it increases injury risk. Does the same principle imply that there should be fewer NFL games overall? So what would you say in response to James's question, Mike?
It's a great question. Obviously, the easiest way to have fewer injuries is to not have any games. I would say that the parameters for deciding the number of games, the number of practices, and the number of preseason games versus regular season games, those are all sort of similar types of arguments, which is what are you trying to maximize? I do know that the league shifted to a 17-3 schedule as opposed to 16-4 regular season versus preseason games. And that's a combination of health and safety factors and also TV ratings, right? How much money the league's going to make. That's where it gets a little bit outside my wheelhouse. I would say that the general guidelines of health and safety, and it's not a group that I'm formally in, but would be our job is to make the game as safe as possible, conditional on the game maintaining competitiveness, right? And so part of it is let's create the best atmosphere and the best game for the players, while keeping competitiveness the same. And obviously part of that is having a competitive regular season and having that excitement. So that's probably my best answer to that, but it's a great question.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I'm going to just, so it was really interesting to hear you kind of lay out the goals, the things that you and the other NFL analysts are looking at in order to sort of achieve the desired outcome, right? And which included safety for or minimizing injury for the players. And you also talked about the teams having their own analysts, and I presume that they're not looking at exactly the same things that you are. So I'm curious if you have any comments about that, as well as um, you talked about in the how much change has come into the game over the last 10 years. Has there been any sense of resistance to using data for these kinds of purposes, or is the community generally pretty open to data analysis as a method of decision making?
So I think the way that teams use data is really interesting because there's just so many untapped areas where you could use folks with these skills. So some teams might have analysts that are focused on player performance and understanding, how can I use this data to make sure players are 100% on Sundays to maximize their ability? Maybe that's preventing injuries. Maybe that's, not making sure they're not doing too much working in practice, or they are doing enough work so that they're ready on game days. Other teams may be on the in-game decision-making side where they're trying to figure out, okay, we need our coach to go for it on fourth down more often, or we need our team to call timeouts at better opportunities. Other teams maybe have analysts doing pro and college scouting so that they are looking at college players and trying to predict, okay, when they get to the NFL, how well will they do? Some teams have one person doing all three of those things, right? Other teams have, a group of, I think at this point there are teams with 10 folks that are on board that are trying to sort of balance all those things. If I showed you the diagram earlier, I think the Browns and the Ravens tend to have pretty strong cohorts, and there are definitely other teams that are in that mix too. There are other teams that only have maybe one or two, right? So, it's kind of not every team uses it the same way, but I do think the reality is a lot of it is based on, who you're working with and what your message is, because there are some teams that really value this stuff and other teams that have different ways of looking at. And ultimately, we just try to provide, with our big data bowl event, one of the reasons we have it is we want to provide them with qualified applicants, right? So that they can figure out who are the people that can come in to analyze this data. So, who and how they go about it is not, something that we totally know, but that hopefully gives you a sense of it.
Yeah, thanks very much. I see there's another question from Paul and Lana. Any quick comments on the proposed spot and choose model of overtime?
So for Paul and Lana ask about a format that Baltimore proposed a year ago, which is called spot and choose. And so under spot and choose, one team picks a spot on the field, a yard line, and the other team gets to choose if they want the ball there or if they want to start an offense or if they want to start a defense. It's a really clever game theory idea, which is like, all right, if I pick the 10, well, I'm probably going to have to start on offense, and that's pretty far away. But if I pick the 20, I'm probably going to start out defense, and that might be too easy for them. I think it's really clever. I think the things that got in the way, as I go back to what we were trying to solve for, the potential issues is that it was seen as a little too gimmicky. And granted, that's maybe not my view, but that is the view of some of the folks that make decisions on these things. And then another reality was that, and this is not something I totally stressed, a lot of games were going to end on field goals. And I think the idea that games end on touchdowns was perceived as a little bit more of a cleaner outcome in football.
Yeah, thanks very much. Let's see. I'm not sure if I see any other questions from the audience members. Don't see any coming in. So in that case, I will just remind folks to take just a minute and complete the survey when you have a chance. And we will thank you once again, Michael, for a really interesting talk for our audience. So thank you all very much. Thank you for joining us. And we will see you in a few weeks at the next one.
Thank you.